out of air. In this module, you will learn how to breathe correctly underwater. Examine the possible consequences of breathing incorrectly. Find out how to measure the amount of air remaining in the cylinder and how the pressure in the cylinder is influenced by temperature, and also look at some equipment that we can use to breathe from in an emergency. Breathing during the dive. Let's now take a brief look at the various phases of a real dive. The first thing you have to do is assemble the various parts of the aqualung, the cylinder, the buoyancy compensator and the regulators. Remember to make sure that the hose is connected to the inflator-deflator device. Don the aqualung and make sure that everything is working. As soon as you are ready, enter the water in the safest and most suitable way. On the surface, with the BC well inflated and the regulator in your mouth, begin breathing more deeply than normal. After checking that you can equalize your ears, deflate the BC and exhale as much air as possible from your lungs so you will begin descending. As you descend, stay in a head-up position and equalize often. If you exhale through your nose, you will automatically equalize the mask. To slow down the descent, you must inflate the BC using short bursts. After each short burst of air, wait a moment to check your buoyancy, otherwise you risk inflating the BC too much. If you do have a problem equalizing, ascend a little and try equalizing again. If you manage to equalize, you can continue descending. If you can't equalize, you must abort the dive. If you have a problem equalizing just one ear, this might make you feel dizzy. This is not serious. Just hold on to the descent line or your dive buddy. Ascend a little and the dizziness will pass. Once you have reached the planned depth, you should fine-tune your buoyancy by inflating or deflating your BC slightly so that you can stay effortlessly at your planned depth without finning. You can make slight corrections to your buoyancy by inhaling or exhaling more deeply than normal and using the air in your lungs. Now that you are at your planned depth, you no longer need to equalize your mask and you can now exhale through your mouth. Under the water, you should breathe more slowly and deeply than you do on land. One very important thing to remember is that you must never hold your breath underwater, particularly if you take the regulator out of your mouth. To ascend, just give a slight kick upward with your fins. You will become positively buoyant and begin rising towards the surface. As the pressure decreases, the air in the BC will expand and you will begin ascending faster. To slow the ascent down, just deflate the BC a little at a time and try to maintain a controlled ascent rate. However, always remember to keep breathing slowly and deeply. As you ascend, you might get the feeling that air under pressure is trapped inside an ear. This is rare, but if it does happen, just stop and descend a little and wait for the air under pressure to come out. If this also causes dizziness, the best thing to do is to hold on to the ascent line until the sensation passes. Lung overexpansion. Why do scuba divers keep on emphasizing the importance on never holding your breath underwater? Think about the BC. To prevent the bladder tearing, the BC is fitted with one or more overexpansion relief valves that dump the excess air when the internal pressure becomes too great. Your lungs are similar to the bladder of the BC, but they are not fitted with an overexpansion relief valve. If you keep your mouth closed or hold your breath as you ascend, the pressure in your lungs will become too great and cause serious injury. The lungs have a delicate lining of tissue made up of millions of tiny air sacs known as lung alveoli. If the lung sac is closed on ascent, the pressure inside the lungs will become greater than the external pressure. This overexpansion can stretch the lung lining, deform the alveolus, a condition known as lung overexpansion, And finally, tear. If this does happen, air from the lungs can enter into different parts of the body, depending on the type of injury that has been caused. One possible consequence is pneumothorax, which is a collapsed lung that is unable to perform its function temporarily. The escaped air may also collect around the heart, causing a condition known as mediastinal emphysema. This condition causes pain and an alteration to the heartbeat. The air may also collect under the skin, usually around the shoulders and neck, causing a condition known as subcutaneous emphysema. The most serious condition is caused when the tearing of the alveolus involves a capillary. An air bubble can then enter into the pulmonary vein and be pushed by the heart into the arteries, causing a reduction or a blockage in the blood flow to an area of the body. This is a serious condition called arterial gas embolism, or AGE. As the bubble tends to rise, the blood shortage can occur in the brain, causing the symptoms of a cerebral ischemia or an ictus. Preventing these serious injuries is extremely easy. Never hold your breath on a scent, keep your regulator in your mouth, and exhale continuously if you must take it out of your mouth. The pressure gauge. During the dive, it is important that you can estimate how long your remaining air supply will last. To be able to do this, we must have an instrument that works in the same way as the fuel gauge does in our car. This instrument is a submersible pressure gauge, or SPG. The submersible pressure gauge is connected by a high-pressure hose to the first stage and tells the diver the pressure of the air in the cylinder. The sector of the pressure gauge faced near zero is usually coloured red. This area is considered the diver's reserve. When the pressure falls within this sector, it's as if the warning light of the fuel gauge in your car is flashing. It's time to return to the surface. To prevent the air escaping quickly if the instrument or hose breaks, the connection point is just a tiny hole. This also means that the needle of the gauge rises and falls slowly when we open the cylinder valve or purge the regulator. As well as mechanical pressure gauges with a rotating needle, there are also electronic ones, and some do not even need to be connected by a hose, because they use radio waves that are sent by a transmitter fitted to the first stage. Just as you cannot set off on a trip in a car without a fuel gauge, you cannot dive without a pressure gauge. Pressure and temperature. Before you can use the submersible pressure gauge to calculate how long your remaining air will last, you need to know another important fact. Pressure is influenced by temperature. More precisely, we can say that pressure and temperature are directly proportional. If one value increases, so does the other. Cylinders get warm as they are being filled. Later, as they cool down, the pressure also falls. This is nothing surprising, it's normal. On the other hand, if you leave a cylinder directly under the sun or somewhere very warm, the pressure gauge will indicate a higher pressure reading. For example, if a cylinder showing a reading of 200 bar, 3000 psi, at a temperature of 45 degrees centigrade bar, 113 degrees Fahrenheit, is cooled down in water at 15 degrees centigrade, 59 degrees Fahrenheit, once the temperature has equalized, the pressure will fall to 180 bar, 2715 psi. When you calculate how long the air in a cylinder will last, you must take this fact into account. So remember this when measuring the pressure in a cylinder that has just been charged or has been left in the sun for a long time. Air consumption. You can now calculate air consumption. You will certainly remember that pressure increases with depth. Consequently, the volume of the air decreases and the density increases. The air molecules have been pushed closer together. At depth, the regulator supplies air at ambient pressure, which is greater than that on the surface. Therefore, every time you inhale underwater, you breathe in more molecules than you would on the surface. Consequently, you consume more air. So, the deeper you dive, the less time the air in your cylinder will last. There are quick, simple ways of working out how much air we consume per minute under the water. Let's imagine that we are diving at 20 meters, 66 feet of salt water, and we note that the pressure reading is 160 bar, 2,400 psi. After 10 minutes spent at the same depth, we see that the pressure has fallen to 120 bar, 1,800 psi. This means that in 10 minutes at that depth, we used or consumed 40 bar, 600 psi of air, or rather, your air consumption is 4 bar per minute or 60 psi per minute. With this consumption rate, the remaining 120 bar, 2,400 psi in the cylinder will last another 30 minutes at that depth. But if we ascend to a shallower depth, where we will consume less, you will be able to stay there longer. It would be handy if we could also calculate our autonomy at this depth too. An easy way to do this is to use a single reference value, your own personal surface air consumption rate. To work this out, just divide your air consumption rate at depth by the absolute pressure of that depth. In the earlier example we looked at, the consumption rate of 4 bar per minute, 60 psi per minute, was calculated at 20 meters, 66 feet of salt water, where we have an absolute pressure of 3 atm. The surface air consumption rate in this case is therefore 1.33 bar per minute, or 20 psi per minute. To calculate the air consumption per minute at a given depth, so we can work out our air autonomy, just multiply the surface air consumption rate by the absolute pressure at that depth. For example, at 10 meters, 33 feet, of salt water, where the absolute pressure is 2 atm, the air consumption would be 1.33 bar per minute, 20 psi per minute, multiplied by 2, giving a result of 2.66 bar per minute, 40 psi per minute. At this depth, the 120 bar, 2,400 psi of air would last for 45 minutes. On your next dives, your instructor will have you calculate your surface air consumption rate. However, you should be aware that this is a simplified calculation and does not take into account factors that could increase your air consumption, such as cold, fatigue, or stress. You will have undoubtedly noticed that there is a considerable difference in weight between a full and empty cylinder. The air that was inside has been used. This means that the condition of buoyancy also changes, so at the end of the dive, your total weight will be less. As we said earlier, the difference is considerable. For example, an empty European 15-litre cylinder weighs about 3 kilograms less than one filled to 200 bar, and an empty North American aluminium 80 cubic feet cylinder weighs about 6 pounds less than one filled to 3,000 psi. Alternative air sources. Despite the fact that you can calculate how long your air supply will last, you may find yourself in an out-of-air situation, maybe because something has broken, or more probably because you forgot to check the pressure gauge regularly during the dive. What should you do if this does happen? Your instructor will show you different ways of solving the problem. Above all, you should know that every diver carries an alternative second stage or a second regulator, which means he can share his air with another diver if necessary. So that this second stage can be easily identified during the dive, it is a brighter colour than the main one, and the hose is often yellow. This alternative second stage must also be placed in a position where it can be reached easily by a dive buddy in difficulty. This is why it should be attached with a quick pull release around the chest area where it is clearly visible. A diver can also pass this second stage to the diver in difficulty without waiting for the buddy in difficulty to take it himself. The alternative second stage may also be connected to the same first stage as the main second stage. This equipment configuration is known as an octopus. You may also use a separate first stage that is connected to a second cylinder valve. Some divers use an alternative air source that is incorporated into the inflator-deflator device of the BC. In this case, the diver giving air should give his main regulator to the diver in difficulty and use the alternative second stage at the end of the corrugated tube. In this way, the donor can also maintain control of his BC. The efficiency of all the systems we have examined up to now is dependent on a dive buddy. For this reason, some divers prefer to carry a small, separate cylinder. This type of cylinder is often referred to as a pony, and it is fitted with a separate regulator. This is a very safe alternative, and the only system that allows a diver to be independent of his buddy. Divers have devised various systems for solving an out-of-air situation. However, this doesn't stop the marvels of the underwater world from leaving you breathless. In the next module, you will discover how sound behaves in the water, learn how to communicate on a dive, examine the buddy system more closely, and look at some useful diving instruments and accessories. Until the next time.